donate to medical science.
Yeah.
Ed really had said, I mean, his Judaism was complete.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't want to have seen done. However, if they can learn from my brain, I will know their baptizing.
The study wants us to donate our brains.
As he was dying, the day, I mean, he aspirated sometime between 12:15 and 1, and he died at 11 o'clock at night. And as he was dying, probably around 8:30, I called his doctor. I don't even know how I got Sid Gilman's phone number. And I called him and I said, Dr. Gilman, that bird is dying. I said, he will not make it through the night. And I said, he did say that he had his brain to research. Gilman said, first of all, they couldn't hurt him. He said, I know the Jewish and I want to bury him as soon as you can. Which would have been, it was a Saturday night, so it would have been Monday. He said, I know that they can't harvest the brain for sure until Wednesday because of the others. He said, I know you'll be willing to do that. However, Ed had seizures. He had TIAs. He said his brain was so compromised by other things that we won't learn anything from his brain.
Oh, really?
So he said, the thought was wonderful, but we will not take his brain. He said there was just too much. And
Something. It sounds like maybe it's working. I can't tell if it's the... This is me trying again. There we go. I sound much more omnipotent. Hi, little fur baby. You're so cute.
Hello, hello, hello. Hello, everybody. Hello, hello there. That's better.
Hello and welcome.
Hello, everybody. Yes.
You are now entering the sanctuary of Temple Beth Emeth.
Okay. You want to put your stuff somewhere else, or where you?
Just put it down here.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. It always feels weird when the time changes of saying good evening at 5:15, even though like 2 weeks ago it was dark right now. But I suppose this is still technically evening, early evening. So good evening, everybody. It's great to see everybody here, and to welcome April Baskin to as you reach down to our congregation. When I heard that April was going to be a part of the symposium that's going on at the School of Social Work and the Jewish Communal Leadership Program, I was excited, one, that she was coming just for that, but also that we would get the opportunity to engage with April and hear about the work that she's been doing within the Jewish community for many years now. Most recently, April was, she's the immediate past vice president of Audacious Hospitality for the Union for Reform Judaism, and founding VP of Audacious Hospitality. So April has worked tirelessly for many years on inclusion in the Jewish community, on helping to make our communities more welcoming. I think you were working for Interfaith Family, correct, before URJ, is that right?
Correct.
Yes. April's work, I don't know, all of your professional career has really been in sort of inclusion and welcoming in the Jewish community, it sounds
basically.
like. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons why I was excited to have April here is, one, I think we're living in a moment for the last few years, certainly, of thinking about race within the Jewish community, about how we have sometimes, I hope, been successful in welcoming Jews of color into our communities. I imagine probably more often than not less successful. And to talk about issues of racism within our community, but also to hear about April's experience as a part of the leadership. Is it a circle, council? What was it called exactly? The
steering committee.
Steering committee. The steering committee of the Women's March this past January in Washington, D.C. And given the sort of heated national conversation
That's an understatement.
about issues of anti-Semitism within the leadership of the Women's March, I am fascinated to know more about April's decision to be a part of that, what that was like to be engaged in those conversations and addressing those issues firsthand, and how she reflects on that experience after having done that just 2 months ago, less than 2 months ago at this point. And then, of course, I think the sort of intersectionality that exists between these two topics of racism within the Jewish community and feelings of around anti-Semitism and within the leadership of the Women's March. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn this over to April, and just thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and challenging us to think more deeply about how we live in our world broadly, but certainly in our Jewish community as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And so we may figure out, we'll sort of feel it out. I'm one who I think I recently heard someone say in an audiobook I'm listening to called Disrupt Her. She said it perfectly, a belief of mine, which is that iteration is perfection. I love this concept of getting better as you go. And so currently, right now, we have 2 microphones that are placed on either side, and at different points there will be opportunity for a discussion. And feel free to get up and walk to the mic, or if it's easier, if that's annoying, if you're like in the middle of some awesome, wonderful fellow Jews and or Jew-adjacent individuals, then you can just raise your hand, and I love getting my steps in, and I or someone else who also loves getting their steps in can go to the mic and hand it to you. Okay? And if we can use the mics, I think that's really, really great. I often like to joke that when you ask a room, can everyone hear me, the person who can't hear you can't raise their hand. So I like to just default to being as inclusive as I know how to be. And I think for me, disability inclusion is an area for me where I continue to work on some of my internal biases in growing areas. And I think my general belief is that a number of us, because of the society we live in, have different biases or blind spots, and we can be gentle with ourselves when those get pointed out to us. Okay, so a little bit about me. Where to begin here? It's interesting. As of about up until this past January, I had a pretty polished, tidy presentation and set of presentations that I would give to congregations and communities, and then what's a nice word for a sanctuary? A cluster fudge. Like there's been so much that has transpired in the past 6 months that I'm still personally feeling out from a sociological and interpersonal lens where our community is. And so I'm in real time. I'm both prepared with a lot of the material that I've been presenting recently in formal training settings, but since this is a communal space, I want to leave room for it to be more interactive and for there to be a lot more conversation. So I'm planning on doing a little bit of an intro. You notice you have colored sheets. I'm going to get to that momentarily. A former colleague of mine, Gila Hadani Ward, who works at the Union for Reform Judaism in the Strengthening Congregations Department. When I worked at the URJ, she often liked to talk about how she classified the work of Audacious, the portfolio of Audacious Hospitality, like salsa. There was mild, medium, and spicy. And so we're going to be doing something that's a little bit, it starts out mild and then it quickly gets to medium and spicy with the colored sheets of paper. But I think it will be fun, and I think we'll find it interesting, and it'll be fodder for further conversation. So I think before we begin to have some group conversation and dialogue, it would be helpful for me to introduce myself a little bit more and say a little bit more about who I am. Some of you may know me fairly well from the Union for Reform Judaism programming, but many of you may not know me. Are there a number of people in the room who, outside of what Rabbi Winston just said, don't really know who I am at all? Splendid. Great. Perfect. So that it won't be redundant. Fantastic. So let's just start from the beginning a little bit. So you heard about what I've been doing in my career, but what led me to do that, and how in the world did a brown person end up here on the bima at the front of the room talking to all of you? Well, I'll tell you. So I grew up in a Jewish multiracial family. My parents were, I like to say, were and still are an interracial couple. My father is black with Native heritage, and also both Jewish heritage as well as Jewish adjacent connections, which I can mention in a moment. And my mother is a white Ashkenazi Jewish woman. And they were initially an interfaith couple, but they were emphatic throughout my childhood that we had a Jewish home, and that was very important. And my mother says that to this day that both of my parents are transplants. I grew up in Northern California. I actually grew up all over the country, but 4th grade through high school, I grew up in California. My story is actually multi-layered and really complex. I'm going to do the shorter version so we can get into more of the more substantive conversation collectively. And then if you have some more specific questions about me, I'm happy to answer them. But both of my parents were transplants from New Jersey and grew up in pretty predominantly Jewish areas. And my mother says that if we'd stayed in the Northeast, that we may have been a little bit more secular and not as involved. But growing up in Sacramento, in an area where it was mostly people who were Christian or Latter-day Saint or Mormon, it really galvanized my mother. And after a couple years of there being a lot of Christianity in my public school classroom, we found a synagogue, got super involved. My mom got involved with the board, and basically the rest is history. I grew up in Sunrise Jewish congregation. The synagogue was the same age I was, so it was very young. I was a part of, my mother led, and like as much as a kid can be, I watched the congregation establish a building and move from a church to a donut shop, to a building next to a storefront next to a donut shop, to our own synagogue with like a big menorah, and it was like a whole big deal. And we celebrated its bat mitzvah the same year I celebrated mine, and it was really influential and was one of the core building blocks of my community organizing and the value that I place in community, and also the value I place in community despite its fallibility and human fallibility. I saw there that during really hard times, how powerful community can be, and in my case, specifically Jewish community. And we'll come back to this, and that has informed my work, how I orient myself to community, that when I have hard times, last summer I ended my engagement, and like the statement that I said to myself as I, a few weeks later, announced it over email to my close family network, and then on Facebook, was like, I believe in community, and for me this is a part of that. And I informed people, like the same way that I informed people that happened, I also need to let them know, and that there's a wisdom and a value in that. And we'll come back to that around the Women's March, and the value I place in continuing to be in relationship with people, even when they make mistakes or even if they hurt me. Because I do believe that we are still stronger together, and it's only through ongoing relationship that we can hold people accountable, that we can be in conversation and grow together. So there's much more I could say. In high school, in my sophomore year, my mother, as a punishment, sent me to a nifty regional event, which is the Jewish youth arm, reform arm of the youth movement, which is where I first got to meet Rabbi Josh Winston in nifty Central West. And the rest was history. I loved it. In my senior year, I became the social action vice president. That's basically still what I'm doing today. I consider that like a key moment in my trajectory. Like when I was applying to do an AmeriCorps leadership program in college, when they asked me like what was a key pivotal leadership moment, it's like, it's still nifty. It's still the outreach work that I did there, and seeing how by really being effective and helping to reach out to my peers and engage them in Jewish life, that shifting their orientation to Judaism and the fundamental sense of belonging they had was still something that I felt and feel incredibly proud of, and that I think is really important. So I think that kind of explains how a brown woman is Jewish up here talking to you. Did I sufficiently answer that for now? Does anyone have any questions about that? But no, really, it doesn't quite make sense. Oh, something else helpful for you to know is that my bat mitzvah and my bat mitzvah speech, my Torah portion was Bereshit, and I somehow combined the themes of Bereshit with it being, I don't even remember at this point, I think it was the 25th anniversary of the Black Panthers occupying the California state capitol. Yeah, it was pretty awesome. And it wasn't until college, my congregation and they were just like, we're so proud of you, April, you're so mature, it was so great, they loved it. And it wasn't until college in my senior year when I was writing a thesis about the experiences and identities of Jewish young adults of color in American Judaism, and learning more about the Jewish experience, that I finally understood how unintentionally chutzpahdik that was of me, and how nice and atypical my childhood congregation was. And it explained why, to this day, why my owning class, meaning wealthy Jewish grandfather from New Jersey, at some point when I visit him, almost always is like, April, everybody glorifies Malcolm X, but he really spoke a lot of hate speech. He always talks to me about Malcolm X, and I was like, why does he always talk to me about Malcolm X? And then I was like, oh, because I talked about the Black Panthers in my bat mitzvah speech. And he's still thinking about this. Okay, got it. So with that's a little bit of the background that contributed to where I am today. I think the other thing that's really important to say, among other things, is that what has deeply influenced me throughout my childhood is noticing, I learned a lot about oppression. Just one, by being a young child of color and a Jewish kid in a predominantly Christian area, but I learned a lot more about oppression through watching the experiences of my Black father. That's really quite tragic and hard, and it's miraculous that he's still alive today, but he's a shell of the person he used to be. He was beaten by the police when I was in middle school. My white Jewish mother was fairly naive at that time, and she'd taken him to the hospital because he needed a blood transfusion thing. He had a condition called hemochromatosis, where there was too much iron in his blood. And he wasn't rational in that moment. And at the time, they'd been misdiagnosing him for years as having depression, but it turns out he had hepatitis. But the depression medication was making him act funny and would make him disoriented and confused, and we lived about a mile from the hospital. And he said, "I'm going home." And my mother at the time, my father was very ill because we didn't know that he was years into hepatitis. And he began walking home, and my mother was petrified that he might die, and so she asked the front desk to put the police on the phone because she thought of the police department as a form of safety, and she said to them, "My husband is very ill, can you please help me? He needs to get this treatment. I'm afraid he's not going to make it through the next few weeks if he doesn't get this blood transfusion. Can you please help him?" And they came and they treated him like a suspect and pulled their guns on him. And he had his mail in his hand at the time. My mother tells the story. And he was disoriented. So normally my father and the men in my family know to just be to be very pleasant with law enforcement, but he wasn't rational. And he was like, this is my home. I don't understand. What are you doing? And they sprayed mace in his face, and they beat him to the point that he needed to be hospitalized for the evening. And that's just actually one of multiple stories along his path that are quite significant. And my father is someone who graduated in the top of his medical corps class in the military and was accepted to medical school in Germany. My mother at the time didn't want him to go, and so he didn't, but he was an early hire of Intel. Once he was finally properly diagnosed, which happened, because my dad, being the nerdy man that he is, he eventually, because the medication wasn't working, was placed in a mental institution, a residential mental institution. And my dad, being who he is, befriended the Japanese-American neurologist there, and on one of their morning walks, they were talking, and Isaac, just from listening to my father, said, "I don't think you have depression. I think you have hepatitis. I think you need to go get tested for hepatitis." And once he got on the right medication called interferon, that was basically like chemo, he went back to work. And while he was rectally bleeding and having all these treatments and side effects from the treatment, he worked hard enough that he was able to get a promotion so while he was on interferon, so that when he went on medical leave, it would cover our family for the foreseeable future. He's a remarkable man, and it taught me a lot about oppression to see, particularly when he was beaten by the police. Prior to that, I had a really positive orientation to law enforcement. My brother used to call the police department in Blacksburg, Virginia, where we used to live, and they eventually asked him to come in, and they were so sweet and gave him a tour and gave him a badge and let him push the buttons, and he never called again, and we used to wave at them. And I'd grown up, and I think this is true of a number of people to an extent, thinking that things were a lot better. And when I moved to California, and this kid in my fourth grade, I was in fourth grade and he was in sixth grade, on the bus one morning called me the N-word and the B-word, which was just mean because I was just a shy, quiet kid. And we went to the principal, who was a Japanese-American woman, and she was like, "If you ever say this again, you'll get suspended." And I was just like, wow, our country is so much better. And so for me, in addition to it being devastating what happened to my father, it was a huge wake-up call for me, and began to shift my orientation to understand that often oppression happens that's not seen. And that I thought things were so much better, but that experience caused me to go online and learn about Amadou Diallo, who'd been shot over 40 times in New York, and learn about other incidents that had happened, and that things weren't as there hadn't been as much progress as I was told in school. But most of my classmates unless I didn't tell them what happened to my father, we were just trying to make sense of it ourselves. So I think you get what I'm saying. So seeing him have those different experiences and seeing that for certain people, and I don't think this is just true of race. I think certainly related to this conference that we're having around feminism, and many other issues that for some people, it doesn't matter how hard you work, that doesn't necessarily protect you, or that there's only so much your behavior. Oppression at times isn't actually about you or your merit. It's about the other person's perception and the dehumanization of you that they've come to believe. So I think that's enough about me for now. And on that light and cheery note, what I want to do is a couple different things. We are going till 6:45, is that right? Okay, great. So the next things that I think I'd love for us to do as a group is take a few minutes to chat in pairs. A number of you, I was really honored to hear, and some of you, if not, that's totally cool. We're excited to come hear me speak today, and I'd love for you to chat amongst yourselves what you were thinking you'd be interested for us to be in conversation about. And then we can I want to popcorn style it to get a sense of what's in the room around what kinds of questions or topics you think it would be interesting for me to be in conversation with all of you about. I have a sense of what those might be, but I'd really like to tailor it to what's in the room right now. And also maybe to take a few minutes just to process what I shared and how that's landing with you, if it reminds you of some part of your own journey, related to any part of your life or someone you know, and also something you'd like to hear more about and be in conversation with. And then we're going to do this real-time polling exercise with colored sheets of paper. All right, so if you can, if we can do a pair share, roughly-ish, if there are enough people in the room or so, and I'm going to give you about 3 minutes each, and I'll let you know when we're at the halfway point. Does that sound okay? Okay. I can track it for 3 ways too. If you're in a 3-way, I'll let you know when the 2 minutes are up. If you're in a 3-way, now would be a good time to switch. If you're in a 3-way, now would be a good time to switch.
Also fantastic phrasing. Were you, I'm sorry, I missed this part because I came in a few minutes late. Were you in Northern California?
Yeah.
Where?
Sacramento area.
Not Visalia.
No. further north, I think. Isn't that in the Bay Area?
Sacramento's Central Valley.
No, I'm saying Visalia.
Visalia's Central Valley.
Okay.
So she was, I missed the first 3 minutes. So she was saying it was somewhere up north. And I know Josh from SoCal, but I wasn't sure where you were in the north, and my friend also from Visalia. Like, no Jews.
Yeah.
But you met Josh at
summer camp. Yeah. Regional.
And Josh and I were advisors for him.
Okay, if you're in a two-way, now would be a good time to switch. If your partner hasn't spoken yet, we have 3 minutes left for the 3 minutes left.
Because she was afraid.
Let's begin to wrap up our comments if you haven't already. Please begin to wrap up your comments if you haven't already. I almost forgot to share one of my favorite songs with all of you. So let's do that now. This is a song that I learned. I don't think Koach developed it, but it's a song that I learned from Koach Baruch Fraser, who is currently a Reconstructionist rabbinical student who converted to Judaism through the Reform movement at Central Reform Synagogue in St. Louis. And he is a trans, I believe his business card says, freedom-fighting black trans Jew. I think I got it right. It's the best business card I've ever seen. And he taught me the song that I wanted to share with all of you, and I will provide a little bit of a precursor to it. Are people okay? Are you okay with a call and response? It's fairly simple, I promise. I'm not a vocalist, as you'll see momentarily. But one of the pieces that I didn't mention, but that maybe was a clear, or one could extrapolate from what Rabbi Winston said, is that one of the fundamental themes that's really important to me that I look to advance in the world is a sense of belonging. And that I think that various forms of oppression that operate in society consistently work to tell people that they don't belong. And I think that that's something that is deeply internalized within the Jewish community from the millennia of being told that we don't belong. And so I really love to sing this song because I think it's grounding. And it goes like this. I say a line and you repeat after me. And it gets a little bit faster, and we'll do it a couple times through. Solid as a rock, solid as a rock, rooted like a tree. We are here, we are here, we are strong in our rightful place. In our rightful place. Solid as a rock, rooted like a tree. We are here, we are strong in our rightful place. In our rightful place. That was awesome, great job. So now if we could do a little bit of popcorn style, if you don't mind, if some people want to share some thoughts that came up for you or some themes that you're interested in us talking interested in hearing some of my thoughts on, I welcome you to bring some of your voices into the room, and we'll take a few minutes to get people's thoughts.
So,
Hello.
oh, yeah, it is. Okay, just speak right into this mic. So I'm very concerned about the fractionation on the left that has been occurring recently, and particularly with the Democratic Party, and what that portends for the future. That sort of was exemplified in the Women's March this year. So let's hear it. Like, how did you reconcile all of this? What's the fractionations that you saw? And point the way forward for us.
Little question.
No biggie. Great, thank you. Recorded. And I handed the mic to the second person, so. Oh, sorry, it's not, I didn't turn it on though.
Thank you. Hi, I was going to ask the same question. I mean, you talked about, hello? Is that working?
Hello?
got a good voice.
Oh, it seems like it's low.
I can turn it up. Here, switch it. Because that one was working better.
Yeah, so.
Close.
You'd mentioned something about staying close. It sort of sounded like you were saying stay close to your enemies. So,
Close. Like you're going to eat it. Like it's a delicious piece of cheese.
Hello? Oh, yeah. So I wanted to ask the same question. And what's really going on? It sounded like you were saying stay close to your enemies there before about, Linda Sarsour, I gathered, and or I imagined you were speaking about, what are you doing with all this anti-Semitism?
What am I doing? How am I dealing with all this anti-Semitism? Thank you.
I would like to hear some of your thoughts on how Jews as a group have a long history of being oppressed, and certainly a legacy of oppression, and also certainly in very many ways are privileged. And so how do you reconcile that dichotomy between oppression and privilege? And I guess in a way that
I think that's one.
Repeats some of the questions from the Women's March.
I think that you asked that really thoughtfully. Thank you.
We talked about, on a personal level, how we connect across difference to form relationships, how we can be mindful, we're curious to hear your thoughts on being mindful of our personal identities and how we carry our personal identities into interactions with people who are different from us, and how just how that impacts those interactions, and also how we can, as a community, teach ourselves and each other to overcome the fear that often comes along with building deep relationships, so that we can have a community that interacts in meaningful ways, to build a foundation of audacious hospitality.
These are excellent questions. We'll take a few more. Oh, no, please, no, you first. Thank you.
I'm interested in something you said about remaining close to or friendly with people after they hurt you. And I'd like to hear more about that. It's something that I have difficulty with, and I agree that it's very important. It's not just people that you disagree with, which I don't have a hard time with, but when they've hurt you, how to overcome that and continue to have a relationship. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm curious about, I don't know the demographic of the synagogue you grew up in, but I would guess that they are predominantly white.
They were.
Wow. I'm curious kind of to hear how you navigated that space, and you're talking about belonging, and I would really be interested in hearing how the obstacles and the things that were easy or difficult that you faced doing that.
And let's take one more. I think, or there are two more, I think, yes.
Sure. So recently, accusations of anti-Semitism have been used as a weapon against the left as a whole and against several high-profile women of color who are leaders on the left. And so how have you been thinking about that? And what work does the Jewish community need to do in order to make sure that we're standing in solidarity with the communities that need us to be standing in solidarity?
So good. Thank you.
We don't have a huge Jewish community in Ann Arbor. We have an even smaller community of Jews of color, and I'm struggling with how do we balance representation versus tokenizing people.
Great. Oh, okay.
April, you want more? Or?
I think we're good. But if someone has I think that will take up a good chunk of time.
I'm gonna.
Let's put the cherry on top. Let's hear it.
I'm just gonna ride that last one because it was what I was going with. That personal question in
resonating in the
kid's
room.
School, who's a kid's multiracial kid.
Yes.
They're having a heritage night next Wednesday, which is Purim. and which is meant to showcase diversity. And I brought this up at the school in January, and they ignored that. Yeah, so it's a kind of a question of how do you? There's a lot of they've tried to overcompensate for a great deal of homogeneity in the school by tokenizing in the last few years of his experience, and I'm trying to figure out what kind of interventions I should make in his school to make sure that the diversity is represented well without tokenizing.
Thank you. Such light topics. Well, perfect. So I'm glad you helped. Thank you very much for your help. I appreciate it. I normally do it, but I wanted to capture what people were saying, so thank you for the collaboration. Okay, so these are great questions. And before we dive into them, I'd like to do some real-time polling. Yay! Okay, so I first saw this done in an all-black space at a convening in Cincinnati a couple years ago. And at first I thought, this is silly, but then it started to get really interesting, and I use it now frequently. And I have new questions for this new moment, just for y'all. Yay! So let's dive in. I'm going to start with two easier questions, and then it's going to quickly pick up the pace. And what I want to say is, you'll kind of get a feel for it, but green is I agree, red is no, or I disagree, or hell no, or whatever negatory version of that you want. And yellow is, it's complicated, or I'm in the middle, or it's in a process. And I want to note a couple different things here. One, if there's one that you're not comfortable raising a color for, no pressure, that's totally fine. And also to note, and what's helpful is as people are raising and responding to these, you can look around the room and get a sense of the perspectives in the room. And I want to note here too that this, like different aspects of our identity, some things are very fixed for us and some things change over time. So this is just a snapshot for today at this hour. And next week, we could do the same thing again, and there may be different things that are going up in the air based upon what we're learning and thinking. And so I just want to hold that too, that this is just this very moment. All right, are we ready to begin? Agree, disagree, and neutral. Yeah, neutral, or it's complicated. Well, you'll see. Often there's like this face that people have when they put it up, but you'll see. You'll see how it feels for you. Okay, first question. Are you paying attention? Good. Oh, yes you are. You guys are really like the A+ group. Okay. I like raisins in my challah. I saw that red one go up high. It's okay, so there's a few yellows, but people are pretty clear, like solidly yes or no. Raisins are kind of like a yes or no type thing. Okay, great, thank you. Jews are the best people on the planet. Okay, all right, healthy diversity here. All right, as a group, this will sound similar to one of the questions that was asked. As a group, Jews can be, at times are, both oppressors and oppressed. Oh, we have some serious consensus here. Not entirely, but close, okay, and a very strong disagreement noted. The Women's March is anti-Semitic. Oh, this is, oh, I'm actually really moved by this. Interesting. Okay, thank you. The Jewish community is racist. Fun, fun, fun. So much thoughtfulness. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you. Anti-Semitism is a form of systemic oppression. Mostly agreements, 1, 2 in the middle, a couple disagreements. Great, thank you. Okay. Power, money, and upward mobility will protect Jews from anti-Semitism. Well, okay then. It's important that Jews stay engaged and active in social justice movements. Oh, all right. There were no reds. Okay. It's best to ignore people's differences. It's best to ignore people's differences. Great, okay. Society is set up in such a way that different/various groups are disadvantaged and advantaged at various points in time. Okay. There's a lot in the Jewish community, there's a lot the Jewish community can do to rekindle and strengthen relationships with people from other communities. Oh, I want to pause. Can we just popcorn this out, like what people are thinking? Like, do people have specific ideas about this? About what the Jewish community might do to rekindle and strengthen relationships with people from other communities? Or shall we just continue? Yes. Okay. 1 second.
Condemn people like Adelson.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Why would one condemn
He's
Adelson?
He's a racketeer, okay, and he's pro-Trump, and he'll give any and all money to our president to promote his evil. Okay, he disparages Jews that want equality for everybody, even in colleges. Jews that want to speak against Israel.
So if I hear you clearly, what I'm hearing you say is that it's worthwhile to criticize
him.
Public Jewish figures who do not align.
Stand up and criticize those that are for Israel, okay, by condemning people that are forwarding justice in the United States.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts about this?
I think in order to repair Jewish relationships with other communities, it's important to recognize that, like, there are Jews who are parts of other communities. So, like, it's not like the trans community is entirely separate from the Jewish community, because there are trans Jews, and it's not like communities of color are separate from the Jewish community because there are Jews of color. And, like, recognizing that I think our oppressions are linked is part of that, and I think another part is showing up for other communities when asked to do so or when needed.
Showing up for, thank you. Thank you very much for those. And another thing that I would add to what you said is that for me, part of what that also looks like is reframing how we even talk about Jewish identity. So that rather than just saying there are Jews of color, beginning to say we are a multiracial Jewish community, or we are a community that has gender diversity, and that we begin to understand that it's not just those specific individuals, but that affects and shifts the whole. There was a hand over here.
So I think engaging in direct conversation with communities that are not our Jewish community. And I'm thinking of an event that was planned and actually was unfortunately canceled with Jewish and Muslim interfaith youth. And I think that would be just a tremendous opportunity. I hope it gets rescheduled, but to really have face-to-face, in-person dialogue outside, not just preaching within the choir, but combining choirs and singing together.
Thank you. A couple more hands. Thank you so much for contributing your voices. Yes.
one thing that would be valuable for me would be to know the commonalities as well as the differences among not only racism and sexism and homophobism and transgenderism, because I think we share a lot in common, but there are definitely distinct heritages that go along with that we may not be aware of.
Right, that's a great point. Right, where are our intersections and what's different? What do we share, and also what's distinctive about our different groups? And I think that both of those are critically important, and often they also will take two more comments. And also often I find that what's distinctive about different groups often ties to the specific nature of the oppression that they've faced, that often has developed for better and worse, and usually for better I'm getting complex here. Within an oppressive context, a number of communities have certain behaviors that in an oppressive context over time was useful, but outside of that oppressive context, often those are in the water, it's in the food, it's in our culture, and other communities have a hard time understanding. But if you look back at the oppression they experienced, like in the case of Jews, one of the places, I'm just riffing here, and I'll get to both of you, but one of the things that one of my favorite Jewish leaders, Sherry Brown, who directs the National Coalition Building Institute, talks about, is she talks about the dynamic of the hook that happens between Black and Jewish communities, where because of the nature of anti-Semitism and the fact that it would spike very suddenly and often would lead to death pretty quickly, Jews over time have developed a very rapid and fierce response to what they sense as dangerous, right? And when there's something that the Black community does, which I'll just insert here and cut to the chase and say, I often don't think that response is quite always adequate, because Black people, generally speaking, don't pose the same threat as white nationalists or white anti-Semites in this country, that there's behavior that needs to be cleaned up, but it's not on the level of the Shoah or pogroms or the Tree of Life shooting. But we have, from the terror that we have experienced for millennia, a particular response that Black people experience as racism when it hits them. And then Black people often say, I'm out, I'm leaving you. And by isolating Jews, that is anti-Semitism, to leave Jews in that place and to isolate. And in part, Black people do that because Black people don't have a fast response, and that's not something that they understand from the Jewish community, because when Black people have responded rapidly, in part because they're so different, the way anti-Black racism works is that either they're not taken seriously or they will be in danger if they do that. And often they don't move quickly because, for instance, say for hundreds of years during slavery, it didn't matter how fast you ran or how quickly you thought, they would just kill you, or they would find you somewhere else and someone would know who was your slave master and send you back. So speed is not, that's often Black people in this country have a different, I'm speaking in broad strokes, I'm not speaking about individual people. My father's, I'm not speaking about specific, I know slow Jews, I know fast Black people. I'm speaking broadly in terms of communal responses, okay? And so you have this hook dynamic where you have these two patterns that clash, and what it's originating from is the traumas and the ways that those people were treated over time, right? But there are a number of things that we share, but if we can learn, one of the points that I would get to that came up in some of people's questions is there's a lot more learning that I think needs to be done around how that oppression landed on people and how that ends up playing out. Because one of the things that I found interesting that I saw playing out with the controversy with the Women's March is I repeatedly saw communities using their best thinking with their horse blinders on that they were not conscious of, and thinking they were doing a good thing and the right thing. And of course, this other community will understand, and I think that they'll even respect that, and me being like, oh no, and the other community being like, that's the worst thing. that's the worst thing you could say. We don't want that. We want this thing. And I saw that on both sides playing out, that people's bruises kept getting bumped off, and the other group not realizing that that often wasn't the intention of the other community. Thank you for that. You had your hand up?
I wanted to build on the idea of conversation, which a number of people have brought up, and stress the importance of listening And I think it's important for us to not jump in and say, oh, I know exactly what you mean, because I experience ABC as a Jew, because I think that discounts the experience of people in other communities. And so Jews are known for being very talkative. I think sometimes we just need to shut up and listen to really understand what the experience of somebody else is.
Thank you for that. And I want to follow that up with some thoughts, and then would you, to say, I think that that's an excellent point. There are a few other pieces that I would add into that, build off of what you're saying. To say that one of the things that Sherry Brown teaches in the National Coalition Building Institute is that when you're working across lines of difference, particularly in an area of conflict, is that it doesn't work well for both individuals to be talking about their pain simultaneously. Like you can't do that. One of the groups is going to have to temporarily be quiet and listen. And I'm specifically talking about an interpersonal exchange, right? And the metaphor that Sherry uses is you need to let both individuals, one at a time, empty their cup. If their cup is full of their pain and their fear and their stress, they're not going to hear you. You have to allow a space, and they have both ways for them to be heard. And one story that she's told is that when she was working in a group and she was speaking at a congregation, and there was a Palestinian woman in the room, and she was a heckler, and she stood up and shouted at her, like you people never listen to us, or something like that. And I think the presentation carried on, and she went up to this woman afterward, and the woman yelled at her, I think for about 15 minutes. And Sherry said that it was really hard, but she intentionally just stood there and actively listened to her. And at the end of that, she said the woman started crying and said, I've never felt listened to by a Jewish person before. And I'm sorry that I yelled at you, but I didn't think you were going to hear me, but you heard me. And after she emptied her cup, and not that I'm saying this happens every time, but it often does, if we have the wherewithal to do that. And so one thing I would say is that I think it's incredibly complex for Jews in this moment. I think I'm stating the obvious when I say that. And one of the things that I think we can be proactive about as a community is creating more places for internal conversations and dialogues about this, in places where we can also empty our own cups. I think we're carrying a lot. I think part of the dynamic of how anti-Semitism functions in society is that Jews, as well as other groups of people, are expected to act like everything's fine when we're out in public, like we're not functioning with a sense of terror that is rightful and makes sense. I think a great example of this, Yotam Marom, a Jewish activist, wrote about the scene, and I think it was a show called This Is Your Life or something like that. Maybe some of you saw this, and it was the first time on that show. That show was the first time that a Holocaust survivor was publicly identified on national American television. And I'm forgetting what her name is right now. She had a European Jewish name, and it was quite disturbing and profound. And it's a show where they bring you up and you don't know what's happening, and they post your story on the screen and play it out. And they said, hi, and I don't remember her name, I apologize, I'm blanking on it right now. Like, hi, Gita. Now we're going to talk about Gita, and she went through the camps in Germany, and it was hard. And to me, what he says, and I agree with this very much, is that it's this fascinating portrait, in part, a fascinating representation of what it was like to be a Jew in America, because she just stood there calmly, because it was on national television, acting like it was fine, while he talked about things that a healthy response that someone might have would to be in a ball on the floor sobbing because this person literally said that her family was murdered in the Holocaust. And now you're living with so-and-so, and isn't that lovely? And now you're in America, and it's just fine. And I think in a nutshell, that describes part of what happened. And to me, the Rosenberg trials were a part of that, is that it only really took once, for two people to not receive a proper trial and to be executed on a national stage in an anti-Semitic matter. And that terror is something that I think is deeply internalized and functions often just below the surface in our community. And that's in part why I think it's very hard for Jews to talk about race and whiteness, and why I think it's so important, specifically important for Jews, specifically for white Ashkenazi Jews, because with Jews of color there's a whole separate, related conversation that we get to have around being Jews and people of color in society and how that plays out. But that white Ashkenazi Jews get to have about their complex relationship with whiteness, about the price that we paid for, at best, conditional access to that, about these different experiences that I think still has not sufficiently happened for American Jews. And so I think that that's a necessary step that we need to begin to create spaces for to have, because then of course it makes sense when we're in movement spaces and people are telling us to back off because they're just seeing us as the other white people. For us, that's deeply triggering, in part because we need to find that space to have that work and to receive that acknowledgement and to do our own work. And I think we also get to ask for our allies' work in that too. But I also think that the first step in that is for us to also get more clear and to give ourselves the space to process it, to gain more clarity for ourselves about what are our specific asks, what's fair to ask other people, what is ours to own in terms of saying, these are different patterns that made a whole lot of sense for us in light of different things that we've gone through. It makes sense that we wouldn't trust other people after everything we've been through. And maybe now we see that there are communities, and in order to do this work, we do need to begin to trust, and that's hard. But I think a lot of that is something that we need to internally process, because it isn't necessarily, for instance, like Black Americans' fault that for hundreds or thousands of years throughout Eastern Europe, we had to deal with pogroms and get kicked out country after country after country, right? We're talking about hefty stuff here, and so I just want to acknowledge that. There was a hand over here, and so is what I'm saying making sense to people? And that's not to say that any of it's our fault. Thank you for the green sheet back there, much appreciated. But also that, and the thing is, this is a belief, and I'm open to people, to getting pushback around this. I still question it myself, but I believe I have a very anti-oppressive perspective, and I also, I know it's not so ladylike, yay feminism, and I also, my mother would be dying right now, she's not doing this. It's very unbecoming, April. Oh, I was just saying I have my leg up on the chair, and that would drive my very proper Jewish mother insane, and say that it's very unbecoming, but I'm wearing athletic leggings, so I think it's okay. Anyway, that's my internal dialogue that now you all heard. So, what was I about to say? That I believe in, I think in part, this comes from me being a multiracial person, and so fundamentally having, on some level, a paradoxical identity in and of itself. And so I simultaneously hold a deeply anti-oppressive, pro-justice lens, and also a deep sense of radical responsibility. I also feel this way about the Black community. I am deeply, deeply compassionate for where the Black community is in this country after the years of systemic oppression that have taken place, after being barred from receiving the huge benefit that the white middle class America received in getting free home loans or reduced home loans, and gaining and building the middle class that Blacks were basically, 98% of them were restricted from participating in. I understand where different unhealthy behaviors come from in our community, and I also believe ultimately there's no one, just fundamentally, it's not even a value, it's just practically, there's nobody else who can save us but ourselves. They can do it in partnership with, and we can say that it's not our fault that there are certain things that are happening in urban environments, and it's not necessarily those children's fault, and yet someone, as individuals, we do have to find a way to make a different choice and to change course. And that's a tough tension to hold, but just as to put that in a different context that doesn't maybe feel quite so abrasive, that's how I also apply that in a different cultural context. I think of it as a compassionate accountability. I know a lot's happened since you raised your hand.
this was an answer to the question of how we could build partnerships with other groups, but actually still quite pertinent to what you're saying right now, which is that I think over the long term, a powerful way that we can build connections with other groups is to teach our children to answer questions non-defensively about their identities and their beliefs, and to ask questions about other people's beliefs, but on a personal level, as opposed to on a representing a group level, and to teach our to teach our children to just have those questions and those conversations about who people are. I think it's less easy to implement that on an immediate level. Like, I think I'm very hopeful about the possibility of teaching that on a longer term timeline.
Great, thank you. So there were other questions, but I think I'm going to potentially switch gears. So I have a couple different thoughts. I see a few more hands. I'm feeling some pressure to respond to the questions that people brought into the room, but I also think that I've covered some pretty hefty material, so I'd like to take about 3 minutes for people to be in conversation with each other, and then I'm going to begin responding to some of the questions that were asked a little earlier on, if that's okay. But if we could take a few minutes for people to turn and just share with each other what's on your mind right now. Is there something that you thought that was interesting? Is there something that you disagree with? Just what's going on in your head right now? And then we'll come back in a few minutes. I love your socks. Oh, you know. Take about 20 more seconds, and we'll come back to center. 20 more seconds. I'm thinking maybe if I try a little bit harder, I'll be able to get all of you talking. I know it's difficult. I appreciate all the energy and thoughtfulness in the room. I'm trying to think of a song I can sing. Consider yourself a Jew. Consider yourself one of the Israelites. There's nothing you need to do. Just stand and be one of the chosen few. Thank you for coming back to center. Purim Spiel 1997 in the house. The song gets better as it goes, I promise. So I wanted to speak to some, hopefully all of the questions that we have. That sounds good? And share some of my thoughts and perspectives. Now, let me just say this. So in my dream world, what would happen is we would just push a huge pause button, and there would be like 3 months of intensive learning happening in various communities, and then us coming together and having another 3 months to learn together. And it still wouldn't make everything perfect, but I think it would help a lot. That my general sense of what was happening with the Women's March is that there's still a number of missing pieces, and there's a lot that that multiple communities aren't aware of about each other, and I think that we were being very, very effectively pitted against each other. And to say on a really practical note, less than the theoretical, is that I'm working on developing an online seminar, mostly for clergy and other Jewish leaders. That's a 5-session course with 2 hours each, around just one specific element of this, and so intensive trainings that go through a lot of material. So I just want to note that I'm going to be responding to this, and typically when I talk about these different pieces, and I knew that this was going to happen, this was going to be an inherent tension in this conversation, is that there's a lot more background and foundation that I would love to say about how systemic oppression operates, about different histories and different pieces. So please note that, and I may allude to it at times, and I really mean it, that there's a lot more that I would want to unpack. And so I want to note up front that this conversation, if it isn't already, may be hard for some people, and I invite you to take time to process it further. So with that, let's dive in. Okay. So I wanted to first clarify, I think, the one question that I heard that was really interesting to me, where someone asked about my thinking around staying close to my enemies, and she specifically named Linda Sarsour, and what am I doing with all of the anti-Semitism. So I wanted to start with that because that's a fundamental difference, I think, that I and a number of other Jewish women of color who are leaders in the Jewish community have. That's a slightly different orientation than other people in the community. So first of all, I don't think of the individuals I'm referring to or that we're talking about as my enemies. I'm pretty clear on who my enemies are. They usually are the people who are pretty clear that they're my enemies and say that they want me, and people like me, whether they be Jewish or black, or at times women for that matter, dead. They were the people who were in my class in Blacksburg, Virginia, who called me the N-word every day and whose parents were involved in the Ku Klux Klan. They were the people who, my first grade teacher, who I'm sure actually probably was a good person, but never treated me kindly, placed me in all remedial classes, and never believed me when I would either tell her that I'd hurt myself or I had a question. In terms of people who are working within the progressive movement, who I may or may not have different perspectives of, I generally take the time to learn about different people and see their track record. And so something that I'll say that may be hard for some to hear, and again, we only have a little bit of time here, but it's an ongoing process, and there are still some questions that I have, but I consider Linda Sarsour a personal friend. I met her because she came as a speaker to a national Jews of Color gathering that was hosted by Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and the Jewish Multiracial Network, and she sat on a panel with Arab heritage Jews, with Mizrahi Jews, and was so kind and thoughtful. And both she and a number of people on the panel talked about their over 10 years of organizing together and how much they trusted each other. And the leaders at Jews for Racial and Economic Justice are thoughtful, smart Jewish leaders who I trust. And also, she said to us in the room, and I really took it to heart, and we've since had other conversations on a one-on-one level that further cemented that, that she said if we ever needed her, that she would be there. And I don't even remember specifically what she said, but I, in that moment, and since that time, left with a very visceral sense that, God forbid, should something happen to my black partner, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure how some of my colleagues in the Jewish community would respond, but I knew from my interactions with Linda and from her work of organizing with Jews in New York that she would be there and that she would believe me and that she would have my back. And that meant a lot to me, because I remember what it meant to me when our family friends, who are my parents' best friends, and also the mother was the cantorial soloist of our congregation, were there for my family when my father got beaten by the police and helped bring us home and helped make food for us that night. And I haven't heard that from many people in the Jewish community, but I've heard that from Linda, and that meant a lot to me, and that was the start of our friendship. So I don't consider her an enemy. I've sent her personal messages before. I mean, we're both really busy, so it's hard, that at some point when we have time, I'd really love to hear more about her perspective on Israel, because there's certain things that I've read, and there's a ton of misinformation about a number of leaders. I think that's another thing to note that's a dynamic that's playing out right now, is there's a lot of bias in the media. One of my favorite things to point to is the common misquoting, where it says that Linda said that you cannot be a Zionist and a feminist. And if you go back to the original article, that's not what she said. I'm not necessarily saying I agree or disagree. I think it's debatable. The original quote that was published, that's easily researchable, she said, I have a hard time believing that someone can be a far-right Zionist and support the oppression of Palestinian women and be a Zionist. Now, you can actually debate that. That's a very different statement than saying you can't be a Zionist and a feminist. As far as I know, she's never said that. We were friends for most of our friendship in the context of her knowing full well that I was a vice president of a Zionist organization and that I identified as a progressive Zionist, and that never was something that came up as a challenge in the context of our friendship. In terms of what I saw playing out in terms of anti-Semitism, this is another key point to mention that I've recently, with the publishing of a book that Professor Mark Dollinger wrote, it's very interesting, that I might recommend to people, called Black Power, Jewish Politics. It's a really interesting book, and in it there are a number of quotes from Jewish leaders from the 1960s and 70s that paints a very different picture than the one that's often retold about that time around the Black Power movement and the Jewish Power movement coming into being. And it was fascinating to see that there were a number of quotes from these mainstream Jewish leaders, the president of the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League, saying similar, really nuanced statements, saying things like, both publicly and internally within their own organizations, we are noticing that there is a bit of a rise in anti-Semitism in the Black Power movement, but this is what one of the leaders said, but my sense is that this is something that's likely temporary, and it's a part of their process of claiming their own identity and pushing back against negative dynamics. And I think it's something that it's important that we address as a community, but that we be thoughtful about it and not do it in such a way that it damages our collective work for racial justice. And my initial thought when I read a number of these quotes that were similar to that was, what happened? I mean, almost to the point of tears. I think the past few months were painful for all of us, and partly it was really painful for me as a Jewish leader of color, because I don't think it was conscious, but what I experienced, I will share with love and a gentleness, particularly from institutions, was a very high level of unintentional double standards. That what I was seeing play out with the Women's March was no different than what I've seen play out over the past 20 years with the Jewish community in terms of racism, and leaders being in denial about it for a while, and then some never. My brother and I and family have had experiences in the Jewish community for which we've never received apologies. But I'm still here because I'm able to hold the broader picture of what the Jewish community brings to this world and what it brings to my own life, in spite of those hurtful experiences. And for me, what was painful, besides the discomfort of seeing what was playing out, was the fracturing and the allowing of that to happen. I think, one of the people asked about like what keeps me, remaining close to people. How do you do that when they've hurt you? I think something to clarify, is that I wasn't so hurt by the leaders of the Women's March. So I think that was a really good question. I think part of why I was able to do that, I saw that my community was hurting, and that was very serious, and that made me, for most of the consideration after I got invited to be on the steering committee, I was mostly planning to not accept, because it was such a painful and confusing moment for my community, and I didn't think that the community would be able to understand. Right, and ultimately, because of a few specific factors, I opted to do it. And in part, a big part of it, what I would say in the spirit of Heather Booth and of community organizers, is self-interest. That to me, we have to figure this out. And it's hard and it's painful, but I would rather work with people in the Women's March and other individuals than people who have vowed are committed, have a lifelong commitment to the destruction of the multiple parts of my identity. So to me, it's more that we have to find a way. And another thing, going back to these leaders and why I started to bring that up, is that I realized that I share. So initially, when I read it, and I still, even when I sat on the panel, I didn't have a tidy answer yet because I was on a panel about this book, and I said what? I just said, I'm not sure what happened. Where is this kind of ability to acknowledge that there's a problem and also hold a broader picture? And the analysis that I've come up with very concisely is that 50 years happened. 50 years of Jews largely being accepted into the mainstream of America happened. Upward mobility happened for the Jewish community, which just physically put us out of proximity with communities of color. There's not as much conversation. And I think as we were elevated and experienced more safety, the other thing that I think that I shared with a number of those leaders that I think other people of color share is that I think, because I was like, what was different about them? And I've come to believe that many things in perception, sometimes there's neutral perception, but I think as humans we often project even more than we're conscious of. And so I'm very aware of that I know that I'm projecting here, but it still seems to work, is that I actually think that we do share a lot in common. I came to realize that the leaders at that time, given their age and the moment they were in history in the late 60s and 70s, weren't white when they were born, weren't considered white. They witnessed the Shoah and the Holocaust. Many of them were closer to people of color because of the communities they grew up in. And they also experienced a much more intense level of state-sanctioned segregation and racism and anti-Semitism. And I think they, like me, had what I've come to think of as a more finely honed oppression scale that they used to measure things, that I think now, because of the 50 years of relative safety and privilege, and there was still anti-Semitism, but that's how anti-Semitism works, is that it gets quiet for a little while and then it spikes. It's always there. It's always doing things that communicate dehumanizing messages about Jews, but the level of impact goes in waves. And it's been pretty calm. And so my assessment is that many of the people who are responding now, that their oppression scale was more like a 1 to 3 scale, whereas mine and leaders from the 60s and 70s was like a 1 to 10. And there were actions that I think were problematic and that needed to be addressed. But I'll be fully honest. I think this is live stream, so I won't be as honest as I might otherwise be. But there wasn't anything that I haven't heard the equivalent of from Jewish leaders I respect throughout my life around other issues. And that's not to excuse it in any way, but to say that I treated it the way I've treated being in the Jewish community, of this is in the long haul. So often the number of the actions around certain comments that were inappropriate and what I would label as microaggressions fell in like the 1 to 3 category on a scale of 10, that falls into the category of, who is this person to me? Is this even worth my time? Oh, they're a friend of mine? Okay, I think I want to work it out. Oh, they're a national leader? Okay, we need to clean this up, right? But that it's something like, for me, that it's often, especially if it's in a blind spot for them, which it clearly was, given their level of denial, that this is something that I want to take time to invest time and to build relationship and a sense of trust. And that when we're eating food, when there's time, when we're in each other's homes, when there's trust built, for me to say, I really want to talk about something that happened before and it hurt my feelings. I just wanted to hear more of your thoughts about and actually go to that place. But that the best thing that I found over time to have people listen to me in the Jewish community, things have changed a lot from where they were 10 or 15 years ago, is to build relationship. And so I'm using a similar strategy in that context, if that makes sense. Okay. There were so many other things that were raised, and I know we're running low on time. Let's see. I want to make sure to touch on all of it. How I navigated white space, easy or difficult. I will say that for me, I had a pretty idyllic childhood, that I grew up in a community that was oddly inclusive, and I think because we were there from the outset, we were just a part of the fixtures of the community. And it was more when I started getting into college, where I constantly got questioned about my identity, and I had a really different experience, and particularly on the East Coast, because California is more colorblind. It's amazing that we can honor traffic laws with the lights and stuff, because we're just so colorblind. But it was overall really positive in that way. I was really fortunate, which is very atypical. I found when I wrote my thesis about Jews of color, that most Jews of color had a far more negative experience growing up, both within their family and the community. In terms of the fracturing, stay close. In terms of the political realm, I don't know if I'm well equipped to specifically answer that, but in terms of social movements, I think I'm better equipped to speak about that, which I have been speaking about a little bit, but I'm happy to touch on a little bit further. We have 2 minutes left, and then a number of us are hurrying for the session at the social work school. I think what I would say is that I saw on social media, there's a lot. I'm literally creating a course on this very question, so 10 hours worth of content. But what I think I would say in 2 minutes is that something that I saw, a refrain that I saw repeated again and again on social media, particularly from Jewish women, is I'm hurt and I'm really confused. And I would invite us as a Jewish community, and specifically as Jewish women, to acknowledge that and take that really seriously. I think both of those things are really important. I do think that wherever something falls on the oppression scale, as I get into when I teach about this, it can justifiably fall anywhere on the emotional thermometer. Hearing someone say something that is anti-Semitic can be very upsetting. And it can land on us in a particular way. But my scale goes microaggressions, threats from people in power, to someone being in danger, to my father being beaten by the police, being hospitalized, to my brother and my father at different points being stopped by gunpoint by law enforcement, to people being killed. Right, that's my sense of an oppression scale that goes from individual to does it impact the nature of my life? I had a high school teacher who thought I wasn't smart and tried to told me that I wouldn't pass my international baccalaureate exam. That's something that I place higher on the oppression scale. She ran the risk of potentially getting in the way of me getting into Tufts University. I lied to her and told her that I didn't get any schools. She grinned. I was surprised she was that openly about it. Whatever, so I had to hide in order to navigate that, right? That is higher to me on the scale of people having some problematic thoughts that need some work and tweaking. Now, to be fair, most people don't have a little bit more of a personal relationship that I have with some of those leaders in that sense of trust. So I think some things that I would say broadly speaking is that, and I think we're at time now. There's so much. Is that to me, when things feel confusing, that is an invitation for us to say there's something more here that we need to unpack. That either we need to learn or there's some dynamics at play here. And as somebody mentioned, there's this resource. So I know we're at time now. So I just I'm so sorry. So I can stay for a few more minutes. I want to wrap up by saying a few key things about different resources. What I want to say is that online, so in terms of audacious hospitality more broadly, and specifically to the questions around tokenization and diversity, on the URJ website, urj.com/audacious hospitality, there's a link for the Audacious Hospitality Toolkit, and we have a whole module about Jews of color and Jewish racial and ethnic diversity that gets into a number of these dynamics and how to effectively address them. So that's something I think I'm still using we language. I was just recently at the URJ. And also there's some great resources online. Eric Ward's article, Skin in the Game, about anti-Semitism. I know I'm over time, but I just want to quickly say, and then also there's this book by Sherry Brown called Anti-Semitism. Why is it everyone's concern? And I think it gives a really great progressive synopsis of anti-Semitism. And one of the core pieces it talks about, besides isolating and targeting Jews, is that it serves as a wedge issue for the left, for liberation movements. And so what I want to conclude by saying is an invitation or a request from people is to take on the challenge in the coming weeks and months ahead, and also look for resources, potentially reach out to me if it's something that you think it would be helpful for me to develop more resources around, or some of my other colleagues in the field. When these issues arise, to remember this, that I'm just sharing now, sorry we're over time, is that white supremacy, that anti-Semitism and racism are both deeply a part of white supremacy, and they threaten both people of color and Jews, and in order to disable it, as we are working on things, we need to fight the urge to pick one or the other. This is something that's really important to Jewish women of color and Jewish leaders of color, that we need to find a way to hold both. And it's okay if you can't right now, but begin to stretch yourself to say that we need to come up with solutions that protect both groups simultaneously, and they need to be adapted and sophisticated, but we are a smart, brilliant group of people, and we can do it. But that is the challenge to me in this moment, is to not be forced to choose, because when we choose, we all lose. I just made that up. It's cheesy, but it's true. We have to choose. We need to come up with collective solutions for our collective liberation, and I think that it's possible, but we also need to give our space and ourselves time to heal. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, April. A few things before we leave. One, there's a bunch of food in the adult lounge, and I know people are probably a little hungry. Maybe this is your appetizer before you go off to dinner. So don't run away. Eat the food, please. Yeah. Have some nosh. Two. As totally appropriate, of course, there was an honorarium paid to April for tonight's talk, and that came out of the adult education fund from the congregation. So you should know that to do wonderful things, we need people to contribute to make sure that we can continue to do wonderful things. I will always have Ronnie's voice in my head forever. Saying, tell people where the money came from. So, thank you, Ronnie. Every time I say it, I'll probably say, I'm going to always have Ronnie say it. Yeah. 2 cheers for transparency. Yes. And finally, I think, at least for me, I'm always thankful when I come out of a conversation like this with more questions than answers, and I hope that I'm not the only one who wants to continue to have this conversation, and that we can find a way to meet, maybe not all 50 of us at the same time every time, but to have some smaller group conversations about how to engage in this work as a community and figure out ways that we can be doing a better job of showing up and reaching out and being in conversation about these tough issues. Yes. Oh, yes. And then in 2 weeks, so 2 weeks from tonight, hopefully you'll be joining us at the University of Michigan Art Museum, where Rabbi Rick Jacobs will be on a panel with Tilly Seamus, at the executive director of U of M Hillel, as well as Deborah Dash Moore, our congregant and also professor in the Jewish Studies Department, and Carla Goldman, our member, and the director of the Jewish Communal Professional Leadership Program at the university. Hopefully you'll join us there. I believe that's 7:30 next 2 Thursdays from now, and then as well Friday night Rabbi Jacobs will be speaking to us at Shabbat services. It's at 7 o'clock Friday night. It's a little I know, right, Ralph? 7 o'clock, not 7:30. We need extra time. So, thank you, April, so much for being here. Thank you for doing what you do, for being a voice in the communities that you're a part of, and we're lucky to have you. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Social work is. Do you want to say?
If you want to take your cards as a memento, that's fine. Also, you can put them back, but you can stack them on the podium in the back. You can just drop them off.
Eat the food in the adult lounge. You're not allowed to leave without taking something. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask if you were here for our talk, if you could head into the lobby, that'd be great, where the food is. Otherwise, you're getting co-opted into St. Clair's choir, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but you may not want to be. So you should make that choice yourself.
You said food?
I just want to, because they're going to start their choir practice in 1 second, so we can continue, but just outside.
Sure. Okay. So I